Okay, here I am again doing another video. My last day off from work. Wow, I'm really not prepared for this. Hold on a second. Turn that off so the TV doesn't come on. It's my last day off of work. I go back tomorrow, Saturday. I work the whole weekend. Then I arrange to have another couple days off, and then after that I'll probably be more than likely unemployed. And looking for another position. So things are going to be tight. I don't want to spend money, but I've been spending a little bit of money on music. I got a couple things coming in the mail. And a while back, I did a video talking about Buddy Rich, how I first got into him when I was unemployed. During this gap of time I was unemployed for, I don't know, almost 2 years or a year and a half or whatever it was, back in the very early 80s. And I knew who he was. I'm not really that interested in big band music. Most of it's not a real popular style of jazz amongst the VC. So, you know, I have theories onto why I've become a Buddy Rich fan. I don't think he's the best drummer in the world. I don't listen to him for that reason, though I do love drum solos. And I think a big part of it is nostalgia, because when I was like in my high school years growing up in the 1970s, and The Tonight Show had Johnny Carson as the host, and Johnny Carson was a very big jazz fan, and he had Buddy Rich on at least once a year, if not a couple times a year. And there was a lot of fooling around between him and Buddy Rich. And Buddy Rich didn't even always perform when he was on the Carson Show. And recently, on one of the nostalgia cable TV channels are broadcasting in full the old Johnny Carson Tonight Show episodes. And recently, I managed to DVR one of them, and Buddy Rich was a guest. And oddly enough, it was from a date in 1977, in June 1977, which could have actually been the same day that I graduated high school, because it was late June. I'm not even sure of the exact date that I graduated high school, but it was definitely within that week that I graduated high school was an appearance, one of many, by Buddy Rich. It was obvious he had been on the show many times at that point. And I talked about in my earlier video how I had this thing with Buddy Rich where I got heavily into him. Back in the early 80s, I knew who he was. I was already into jazz, but not really big band stuff. And even now, I'm not really into big band stuff, with a couple exceptions. The United Jazz and Rock Ensemble, which I'm basically a fan of because of the people in it. Most of the VC members probably know who they are. European jazz musicians, a lot of German guys. And so Eberhard Weber's in them, Charlie Mariano, Kenny Wheeler, Ian Carr, people like Barbara Thompson, people like that. Wolfgang Downer. Wolfgang Downer was one of the constant members on keyboards. And being a fan of all of those guys individually, that's a no-brainer. There's a few VC members that have their stuff basically because the musicians involved, and not so much because it's a big band. So that was a very modern, probably, in my world, in my mind, probably the most progressive big band, because they weren't just trying to recreate a vibe of American jazz. They were very forward-thinking, I think, and they had that European vibe to them. So I like them as a big band. A lot of people wouldn't consider, well, I don't know if this is considered a big band, but I did a video some time ago on Howard Rumsey's Lighthouse All-Stars. The Lighthouse was a club in Hermosa Beach, California, that featured jazz for a lot of years. And every night they had jazz, so they had a lot of famous people in and out, and a constant band of which Howard Rumsey managed the club, but he was also the bass player. When I did my video on him, there's a couple albums I have by them. I have others on CD. I have other ones on CD. That's Howard Rumsey. When I did my video on them a few months ago, Howard Rumsey was still alive, oddly enough, and he passed away, I think, a couple weeks after I did my video, oddly enough. And I don't know if you would consider that a big band. It's a pretty big band. You know, they have a rhythm section, multiple horns, and stuff like that. And that's very much of a 1950s West Coast cool jazz, not smooth jazz, but what was considered cool jazz in the 50s and early 60s, which was largely a West Coast thing. You know, with a lot of charts, but not extremely up-tempo and really burning up-tempo wild stuff. A bit more laid back, maybe a bit more geared toward the arrangements. But I love Howard Rumsey's stuff. It sounds very old-fashioned nowadays, but it's the charts are really good, and a lot of the players that went through there are very well-known jazz guys and guys that did ended up doing, because they were on the West Coast in California, ended up doing a lot of soundtrack stuff, you know, from the 1950s and certainly the 60s and 70s, when jazz started dipping in popularity. A lot of those West Coast guys just headed to the studio, and you hear their stuff all over the place on television soundtracks, especially television shows and movies too. I think that's one of the things that got me in the early 80s, into the vibe of Buddy Rich. He was somebody that was always there, even before I was interested in jazz. He was popping up on Carson's show. I knew him as a jazz drummer. Wasn't really into jazz at the time. But once I got into jazz, I certainly, you know, and he was still alive and around in the early 80s when I got into him. And something, you know, I got some records very, very cheap, new. These were reissues or compilations of albums. Here's one called Big Swing Face, this was a reissue of the original album, which is from the late 60s or maybe 1970. I think 69, 70, somewhere in there. One of his better albums, a lot of people think, from the late 60s. This cover is not very well known. This was just a reissue from, I want to say in 1981 this was reissued. So this was the album in full. And if you notice, they used the same cover for other Buddy Rich reissue albums, also from 81. So I guess they did these budget reissues. As you can see, it's got a Liberty value on there. Swing a New Band, which is also just a reissue of a full album from the 60s. $3.99 I paid for each of these. These were new and sealed. Those were full albums. But the first ones I actually bought of his, and it was just a kind of a crapshoot because I didn't know any tunes. You know, I didn't have anything to go by to pick up. I just probably picked the first couple up because they were cheap and I liked the covers, which I do to this day. Here's an album called Drummer's Drummer. I showed all these before. And this turns out, this is another $3.99 album that I bought new. These two are the first two that I ever bought. And one called Mr. Drums. I love the artwork. You know, it's cartoonish, but I love the artwork. I bought these at the same, I can know it. Igor Records was the name of the place, over on the next town. Actually, a town called Teaneck, which was pretty much the next town next to me. And it was where Milt Jackson lived. I didn't know this at the time, but this was the town that Milt Jackson lived in. And I picked these albums up there. These two albums are both compilation albums taken from basically the same three albums from the mid-'70s. And, of course, I got a couple others. I got, like, a classic, Rich versus Roach, Max Roach, which Carm pointed out, could be Robert Rich and Steve Roach. You know, I didn't think of that in this generation, because obviously neither one of these gentlemen are with us anymore. So I got into Buddy Rich heavily for about a year and a half. I got a job, and I just didn't listen to Buddy Rich anymore. Then in 2015, early 2015, I lost my job. I was unemployed. Something clicked, and in all that time in between, I bought, I think, one Buddy Rich CD, a CD era hit, in all that time, which I just listened to casually a few times. Then all of a sudden I was unemployed again, and something clicked. I can't explain it. And I started listening to Buddy Rich again, and I pulled out those old albums, started buying CDs. I've actually got 2 CDs on order that I got for very cheap, because in my financial situation, I can't and shouldn't be buying records. This one was a good bargain, a 2 CD set of 2 albums from the 70s. One was called The Roar of '74. It was an album that came out in 1974. And another one called Live at Buddy's Place, because Buddy had his own club for a while. This is a reissue of those albums. These aren't the original covers, but I like the vinyl look on the CD. Now, I'm not technically unemployed yet, but I probably will be as of next week. And something clicked again, and all of a sudden I started listening to Buddy Rich again. Speak No Evil, which is a horrible album, but there's a good one in this one called Plays and Plays and Plays. Speak No Evil was one of those attempts to cash in at what was current in the late 70s, and is horrible. I probably wouldn't listen to that again, even though it's in my computer. But Plays and Plays is a good album. I bought it because it was as cheap as buying just the Plays and Plays album on its own. Here's a good one. These are from the 70s. Big Band Machine. Did I show these? Ease On Down the Road, which is something that came along much later. It's alternate live versions of tracks that were featured on a lot of those albums that I just showed. Most of those are live recordings of club dates, because basically it was a live band. Even when they went to the studio, they played live. They didn't overdub stuff. So this is a lot of the same tunes on some of the previous CDs, but different versions, different live versions played on different nights. So there's enough difference in tempo. If you do a compare and contrast, you could hear the difference. I'm a sucker for drum solos. And Buddy recorded a couple ones with Lionel Hampton. This one's called Giant Steps. This is one of those that's confusing because this is reissued any number of times under different titles. This particular title is Giant Steps. I don't think that's a title it originally came out under. And I got one that's listed as a Lionel Hampton twofer, but the one in here, Hamp's Blues, is actually another collaborative, essentially, album, with two leaders, with Buddy Rich and Lionel Hampton. Is very old-fashioned stuff. Lionel Hampton, kind of conservative, traditional vibes player. And one that goes back to his 50s stuff, compact jazz. I did a whole thing about how I love the compact jazz series, if for no other reason. These are all compilations. The design of all their covers was very cool. They always use this very cool black and white with a few splotches of color here and there on just about all of the covers of this series that came out for probably about the span of 2 or 3 years. And this is very early. This is actually early in the CD era, very in the mid 80s, late 80s, when CDs first started coming out. And a lot of the individual albums hadn't yet been released at all on CD, and they were just putting out compilations for people that were fans of these guys. And even now, not all of Buddy Rich's stuff is necessarily out on CD all these years later. These guys recorded a lot of albums. All of a sudden CDs come out, and they're madly trying to press a lot of things, with a huge back catalog. So a lot of times what they would do is they would put out compilations of these artists first. And I just love the compact jazz series. Sound quality isn't always the best on them, but it's one of those series like the ECM Works series, compilation series, that I just end up buying them because it's part of the compact jazz series. I love this. I love these. And this is a good sampling of stuff that's a little bit... I haven't really seriously yet gotten into Buddy Rich's too much of the 50s stuff and the real early 60s. I started kind of with the 70s and went ahead till his passing in, I think it was 87. But then I went back and most of those albums I showed were actually from the late 60s. And now I've been listening to... the things that I've been interested in. I picked up a couple CDs really cheap, and they're late 60s stuff. So I'm slowly going back. He's known for a couple things. He had music. There's a jazz arrangement that was done for him of a medley of music from the West Side Story movie or play. And even though it's not my favorite music, the jazzed up this little 10 to 12 minute medley of West Side Story things was just about the best known thing that he did. And it's one of two things that he had to play every show he did was the West Side Story medley. And that started in the late 60s, and it's pretty much something that he played almost every concert, if not every concert that he played, up until 87 when he passed away. So it's jazzed up stuff of, if you've ever heard any of the music from West Side Story, you would recognize some of it. And another one is something called the Channel One Suite, which was a really great big band kind of driving thing. And those two were the two best known tracks that he did. And the Channel One Suite, I think, was first put on an album in somewhere between 67 or 70. I can't remember which one it was. But it was one of those things that once it was put on album, he had to, it was very well received, and he had to play it at every concert. And the versions of the Channel One Suite range from 12 minutes to about 27 or 28 minutes. There's a lot of versions of them. The thing with the Channel One Suite is they generally has at least one or more drum solos. I think the original version, the 12.5-minute version, had one drum solo in it. But as the years progressed, it got to the point where there would be times, and also saxophone solo, completely unsupported by the band, that would be in there as well. And there were times that there'd be as many as 3 drum solos in the course of this Channel One Suite, so you'd get this 26, 27-minute piece. I realize that most of the people that watch my videos don't have that much of an interest in Buddy Rich or big band music. So what I did, really, initially for myself, but to get a sampling, because I think most of the people aren't necessarily fans of big band, but they may appreciate something with charts. Like, a lot of people do like the CTI albums that had some Don Sebesky arrangements on there. Not necessarily big band stuff, but stuff with charts, kind of, supporting and in the background of, a smaller jazz band. So I'm going to leave a link up in my comments section here. I created this playlist here on my page of some of my favorite Buddy Rich tracks. And I left the really long things for the end, like the West Side Story Suite and the Channel One Suite, and the shorter tracks at the beginning. And specifically some things that sound fairly progressive. I would think the very first 1 or 2 or 3 things, I would think that maybe fans that appreciate arranged music in more of a moody ECM mode might actually be surprised, certainly at the first track that I included on the playlist, and certainly not something they would ever associate with Buddy Rich, probably. So, and even things like he did, sometimes he did, and most of these were awful, he kind of did some condescending to pop music and played some, going back to the 60s, some arrangements of pop tunes, and you listen to them and it's horrible. It's why did he do this? Even in the 70s he did. But one of them that actually works for me, which I include on my playlist, and he didn't arrange, obviously, only arranging was done by people in his band, was a version of the Beatles' Norwegian Wood, which I think is kind of hip. It's a swing version of Norwegian Wood by the Beatles, but I dig it. I included that in the playlist. The only thing that's in the playlist, and I could include 3 dozen things in there, but I have maybe a dozen or 12 or 14 or so tracks. I kept it short. I'm going to be adding to it, but just to whet your appetite if you have any interest in it, and really should listen to at least the first thing, because you'd probably be surprised. Something called Sierra Lonely, a really pretty piece of great, nice arrangement. And the only thing I included in the list that I'm not is not a favorite of mine, but I put it in there for other people's curiosity, is the Buddy Rich Big Band played a version of Weather Report's Birdland by Joe Zawinul. They actually do Birdland. Not a great version of it, but interesting to hear Buddy Rich play Weather Report. So I included that in the playlist. That's not one of my favorites. It's more of a curiosity item. But just the idea of Buddy Rich playing a Weather Report tune was kind of interesting and intriguing. And if you stay with the whole playlist, I actually have 2 versions of the Channel One Suite. I stuck the original in there, which is 12.5 minutes. and then there's a 26-minute version which I stuck in there, and then there's a West Side Story suite, and then all the other songs are shorter, things under 6 or 7 minutes, or 5 minutes or so. So if you're inclined to listen to them, I think get a good sampling of what it is I like about them. And like I said, a lot of it is probably nostalgia. I knew who he was growing up even before I got into jazz, and so there's that slight taste of looking back, and even though I wasn't listening to him in my childhood, I was aware of who he was, and he was part of that early 70s, late 60s vibe. I certainly was aware of him by the early 70s. So I think maybe that's part of it, and actually seeing him when he was on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show live, when it was a new, not a replay 10 or 20 or 30 years after the fact. And he was a bit of a hard guy, so he's infamous for that. But I just been, this week I've been listening to a lot of his stuff again. I thought with the opportunity to make a playlist, which I'll, like I said, I'll stick a link in here for. Maybe folks can understand when they hear some of these tunes what it is I like about them. And he's, went through many modes. He went through, a pure big band phase where he was in the 50s, more of a remnant of big bands that had almost faded by that point. And then in the late 60s, there was sometimes when he would incorporate pop tunes, which usually, the rock stuff usually didn't work. But like I said, I absolutely loved the Norwegian Wood version, his version of the Beatles track. And, there were some jazz rocky things done in the mid-70s. Some of them didn't work, but a lot of them kind of work for me. So I included a link. I'm yapping because I've got the day off and I'm going to go do my laundry in a little while. I'm back to work tomorrow. And if I do, finish with work, I'll be doing far too many videos in the very near future. But I don't know. That's what's going on with me. I've been, thanks to you folks for getting me out of my funk a little bit. Sending videos and things like that, which Carm and Jeff especially, which I really appreciate. And I'll be back soon, very soon. And hopefully, if you get time and you get a chance, try listening to some of the music in the Buddy Rich playlist I created. A lot of those tracks are just album tracks, and there's pictures in there of various Buddy Rich albums. And some are actually live video of the band playing. I didn't select any of these because they were live videos. I just selected them as purely something to listen to and to glance at occasionally. But there is a mixture of actual live performance videos, from videotapes or whatever, old television broadcasts, etc., that are in the playlist, as well as just album tracks where there's just maybe a static picture, which I actually like. I actually like the static picture videos when they're playing album tracks. So it's a little mixture of all that. I didn't select any of the tracks because it was one or the other. I just selected them because I like the versions of those tracks. So if you get a chance to listen to it, please do so. Thanks for putting up with me now that I'm posting, far too many videos. And, I'll be around and I'll be here and I'll be back soon. Take care.